All right. Any questions?
I know the weather's nice, but we still have classes.
Yeah. I had to show up, so I think you're right.
Me too.
Any questions on some of the homeworks that we're behind in grading? That I'm behind. I will take all the pressure for this, by the way. I am the reason that things are being slow to be graded. Okay? Absolute truth.
There's only the case 2 that's outstanding, which should be done by
soon.
this week.
Yeah.
And then we've already started grading your parts A and B. And we're gonna work really hard to get those done. But we also want to take the time to give you good feedback on that because it's really an important process of writing. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we return those. But you know, a lot of students don't like. Is this the longest paper you've had to write so far by yourselves in grad school?
In grad school.
In grad school.
I had a lot for my trilogy class.
Oh, COBH, yeah.
Yeah, outside of
So
that,
for our HSMP students, this is probably your longest paper thus far. And it's not because I just am, myself and Mr. Youngblood are mean. It's just,
It's not just that.
sometimes takes, we want you guys to be doing this kind of deeper dive into literature on a topic that you're interested in, that if it was just a 5 to 10 page paper, I don't think you'd get to that point, right? So it's a little bit painful for you guys, but it's a good way to build your critical thinking around topics in HSMP and also improve your technical or HSMP public health writing. So we want to give you feedback that can help improve that. So just give us, be patient with us because we like giving you that feedback and having that opportunity to engage with you guys on a paper that's longer. Because with your short homeworks, even with the cases, we don't really get to hear a lot from you guys because those are pretty structured. So this is our chance to really see your writing, the way you process and critically think. So that's my way of saying be patient. Mm-hmm. And the good thing is we give you feedback on your grammar, on your structure, the paper, of your overall thesis that you write. And if you integrate that, that helps us grade your final paper really easy. And it also helps you get a really good grade on your final paper because we can see that you've integrated what we asked. Your paper will be awesome, and we can give you the grade you deserve and that you earn.
Yeah, the worst thing you can do is ignore the suggestions.
That really makes us mad.
Just like, seriously, why did I even grade the other paper? You know, so.
That, and I get told a lot that I'm a pushover, but that really makes me mad.
Mm-hmm.
You will see point deductions if you don't make it.
Yeah, because we do look at our previous comments. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about long-term care. Okay, if you guys want, if you can get an idea. This slide here, I really like because it gives you an idea of what we deal with, right? So long-term care, you have lots of avenues, and it's a literal maze trying to get involved in each of these. Let me go ahead and ask before we get started too deeply. How have any of you had any interactions through family, friends, or I don't know, or where you work, or have worked with any type of long-term care organization? Yeah. So was there anything that surprised you when you got involved? Dawn, you're the only one that nodded, so I guess you're the only one that's answering.
Well, so this is probably, my grandmother still works in long-term care, but when I was a kid, she worked in an assisted living, and I would go to work with her sometimes, and just hang out, and it, like, the wide array of like different levels that the people that lived there were at, because there was like, I know that I like connected with a woman that when she first went there, she was pretty high functioning Alzheimer's patient, and I kind of like watched her diminished to the point where she was just sitting in a chair like with a blank stare. So it's crazy how fast they can diminish, or that they're completely there but they physically can't just do things.
And you said that was in the assisted living?
That was in assisted living. And then I know as a small child I was taken to visit my great-grandmother, and she had Alzheimer's, and that was not an assisted living, it was more like, it was probably
a long-term care facility.
It was a very long-term care facility, and that, I was terrified in there as a child because they just kind of like locked the doors and I just kind of let them wander around if they could walk or in their wheelchair, which freaked me out. But I don't know, I think like from an administration standpoint, I would think you would want to make sure that they're as comfortable as they can be and they can get as much like enrichment as possible, because sometimes they're just stuck in a wheelchair to do nothing. So
yeah, I think those are pretty good observations. The array of patients in assisted living, I mean, that's a home for them, just like long-term care. And so assisted living, you do have a pretty good range. Even in a nursing home setting, the distinctions between patients is sometimes blurred because there's so many types of diagnoses, different types of needs. And I'll dig into a lot of that later, but yeah, those are really good observations. And for a young child, some of those things are really startling. You know, you don't expect that. I know that my great-grandmother was in a nursing home. She lived to be like 97, and she had a diagnosed case of Alzheimer's. And I don't know. I mean, it's pretty astounding that she lived that long. But it's a really interesting dynamic, long-term care, because there are so many different locations. So we have all these. Gosh, I hate this. This is I always forget. This is the one I always forget about. It's got these crazy slides. So here we go. Get it all over with. Man, and I am not going to read these, but now you're awake. All right. So when you think of long-term care, I want you to think about post-acute care. Okay. Now there is long-term acute care. We're not going to talk too much about that, but there, with the variety that there are out there, I want you to think of. Up front, start thinking about funding. You know, we just did a little bit of, we had some cases we did on Medicare, Medicaid. I want you to think about all the different types of funding that could be available for long-term patients, okay? My favorite fact is that most long-term care services are used by the elderly, but most elderly do not need long-term care services. So how does that work, right? It's a really great statistic, in fact. So it means that we're doing something really well with the extension of our length of life, right? We can have a productive length of life where we may not need these services, okay? All right, so there are 7 main components within long-term care, okay? First of all, there has to be a variety of services offered. Not necessarily required that they offer all of these services, that variety, within one setting, but that if you are within a certain setting, for example, with a nursing home where they have long-term care, they will be required to have certain services provided to them, not necessarily on site. Does that make sense? So you'll have a clinical affiliation, okay? The services must be individualized. Why do you think that services have to be individualized? Why is that an important aspect? So we're not talking about institutionalized care. We're not talking about some big broad coverage of all people saying you treat everyone exactly this way. What this is talking about is if you are requiring some type of long-term care, you have a problem, right? And so we should be focused on the problem. So if, you know, it is just like we were talking about earlier, you go into a nursing home, there's such a broad range of diagnoses within that nursing home. How would you just do one type of care for an entire population, right? So because that it is individualized, it must be what the CMS requires it to be well coordinated and total care. And so they have to address every area and every aspect of someone's life, because we're talking about quality of life ultimately. Okay, and then the goal is to promote independence. Now you think of a location, we're not long-term care at inpatient rehab, but that's our goal, is functional independence. In fact, when you're admitted, you get a functional independence score, and then when you depart, you get another score to see how much you've recovered. And then if you require these long-term services, then that means we will indicate within your medical record and your discharge record your level of independence. Why do you think that's important, to know your functional independence as a caregiver?
So you know how much help they need. And
Yeah, so
if you don't want to insult them, if you're helping them eat, and they're like, I can eat myself.
Also true. Yeah, you don't want to insult anybody. That's a very good point. But it goes back to individualized services, right? That's why we coordinate all of this information, okay? So you see how all of this is connected, right? The next three are, you know, it has to be an extended period of care, okay? It can't, we're talking about, it may be an acute episode, but it has to deal with multiple items. So, for example, you may be at home, have an acute episode, go to the hospital, have diminished quality of life, and require long-term care post acute episode. Does that make sense? So you have a heart attack, right, or a stroke, and so your ultimate goal. You know, we had a meeting today, for example, in our hospital, where we talked about stroke patients, and we were talking about you know, some people come in with a certain expectation. They're going into inpatient rehab. We're going to solve all their problems. You know, people say, well, I want to be able to run a 5K by the time I leave here. You may laugh at that, but expectations are really high when people are admitted into inpatient rehab. And come to find out, they may have that goal of running a 5K, but they've never ran a mile. Haven't ran a mile in 10 years. So we have to set really realistic expectations and help them understand where they are, and understand that why we are in existence, basically, okay? And so when we're dealing with extended periods of care, we have to help people realize that it will be an extended period of care. And a holistic care, right? It has to be holistic. What's the idea behind holistic care?
Covering all your bases, I guess. Or not just doing so with medicine, like you're gonna have therapy and
What else? That's exactly right. What else? I heard a bunch of other comments, but
like the social aspect, spiritual aspect, like you're not just focused on the complaint of the
yeah, we're not just medical human beings, right? We're not all about that. Our lives revolve around other items besides our illnesses and our needs, right? We have other needs besides medical needs. And so we have to be, if you're going to deal in long-term situations, you need to focus on the whole of the individual, okay? That's why when you go into a nursing home, everybody always laughs about it, but they usually have a little beauty salon so they can do everybody's hair. In fact, one of my favorite embarrassing stories was when I was getting my administrator's license and I was going through training. I was assigned to work in the activities department. It's one of my first departments. And so I'm in there. I'd been in there for only about 2 weeks, and our activities director got fired. And so I'm on my own, and the day comes up that we're doing nails. And I have never done nails in my entire life. And I have all these little old ladies waiting in line for me to do their nails. and I get this one lady comes up, and I've been doing my best, you know, and she says, "Oh, you're just doing a magnificent job, honey." And I said, "Thank you." And she says, "Can I ask you a question?" I'm like, "Sure." She says, "With all the things that you could be doing, why did you choose to do nails for a living?" So I took a moment to explain to her what I was doing. But my wife has held that over my head. So when are you doing my nails? Anyway, she likes that story. But yeah, it's about everything, right? And it also has to do with the quality of life. Okay, you think about what is it that you're able to do. If you want to go grab a burger, you can grab a burger, right? You want to go to the movies, you can watch a movie. All these things that we take for granted, when someone's dealing with a situation that their health has affected their quality of life in such a way that they require some type of long-term care, we have to start looking at what resources are available in order to provide them the best quality of life. Because certain limitations are put into place just by the nature of their illnesses. Okay, so those are the things that we try to incorporate into long-term care. Some of the different services that are available, start thinking about, medical care, nursing, obviously rehabilitation. We want people to get stronger. We want them to overcome the illnesses that they have, right? Mental health support, social support. That's why you go into a nursing home, you'll have, bingo night, you'll have community night, you'll have all these different things that occur in order to help them have a social life, right? We start social groups, for example, for those who have recovered from, if you have a group of amputees in your facility, they need some social support, and a lot of times multiple people will come together as amputees and talk about the struggles they have and just see how they've overcome these things through different methods. So it's really there to build and make people feel better so that they can if they can't overcome their illness or their issue, then at least be able to cope with those problems. So we also have preventive and therapeutic long-term care. We don't want to cause harm. You're in long-term care, we don't want you to decline without a real reason for it, okay? There are informal and formal cares, okay? When you think of formal care, what do you think of?
Hospital.
Yeah, so you're thinking of a hospital or a physician's plan, right, for you? So what would be an informal type of care? Nobody
At
knows.
home with someone taking care of you that's
Yeah.
not
Assisted
trained.
living, or something.
I'm sorry?
Assisted living. Like
Assisted
some-
living, yeah. I mean, they have lots of informal things, but the funny thing about the informal care is a lot of times we put these informal care items in place, and really it's kind of formal, it's kind of formal because we're planning it, right? You don't really not plan for some type of care, right? So you just have to think about the types of care that you require. So say you have some type of episode, it requires care. And those things that don't necessarily require care, but are there as a supportive type of care, those would be more informal. Okay, does that make sense? It's clear as mud, right? You guys make sense of that? Yeah, okay. You have community-based and institutional services. We'll talk about all of these, by the way. We have different types of housing, and then end-of-life care. Okay? So you have different clients within long-term care. These are people that it covers the whole range of every demographic, right? Doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, doesn't matter your age. All of us could require some type of long-term care. One of my favorite things was when I worked in Chattanooga, I had a resident in the SNF there who when he was about 12 or 13 years old, dove into a pool, and it was head first into a shallow pool. Okay, and so he had really bad traumatic brain injury, and he required extensive care and care that his family couldn't provide for him. So he ended up in long-term care, right? And so one of my favorite things was going in there, sitting down with him, and it was my favorite 30 minutes of the day to go in there and have an excuse to get paid to play video games with this guy. Okay, my kids would come volunteer, they would come in, they'd play video games with this guy, and it was great, you know. But young adults, at this point, he's probably late 20s, and young adults require long-term care. We think we're invincible, not invisible, invincible, and so we do things that can alter our lives, right? And other chronic conditions we can get. So, also people who contract HIV or have AIDS, they require some type of long-term care. Now you consider this. We tend to think of long-term care also on the spectrum of requiring inpatient care or some type of living care. Now, remember, long-term care is exactly that, long-term care. You can have long-term care in your home, right? You can have without having someone necessarily come to your home even. So if you are on a long-term treatment, that can be considered long-term care, okay? So if you are on a lifelong regimen of medication, you would be considered partaking of long-term care because your physician will put you on specific routines that will take care of you for the remainder of your life, or until you're cured, hopefully. You know, so all right. So demographics. If you look at the demographics on this, it's pretty interesting. Working adults, and you're talking ages 18 to 64, 65. That's only 39% of the demographic requiring long-term care services. 1% are children under 18. And then you have 60% are 65 and older. It tells you, and with an expanding elderly population, this number will continue to grow. Okay? And as medicine gets better and better, it'll continue to grow. Okay? So if we think about personal care, we're talking about basic ADLs. You're bathing, dressing, toileting, just the eating, your oral care. All those things are involved in personal care. Custodial care, those are non-medical, and that's just there to help you maintain where you are. That is not anything that's going to help you recover. It's like maintaining status quo, okay? And then restorative care, that's going to help you improve, okay? And it usually requires therapies. So, little scenario for you. You have, you're in a long-term care facility with a SNF. I may be jumping ahead here, but we'll go ahead and talk about it because I want to. And you have a SNF involved, and you have a resident who has an episode, goes out to acute care, comes back, but is not there over the 3 midnight stay, so they don't qualify for therapy. The Medicare will not pay for them to have full-on skilled nursing care, okay? That sounds really complicated, right? Well, it is, it's complicated. Does that mean you cannot do care with that patient, with that resident, to help them get back to where they were? Of course not, right? There are things you can do, and it's called a restorative care program, and most of that is billed under Medicare Part B, okay? Little food for thought, because a lot of times we don't think about that as being part of Medicare B, but in a nursing home, you can bill for Part B. If someone requires to have a decline, you can document the decline, that required medical assistance from a hospital, but they didn't qualify for Part A therapy. So you can run a little bit of therapy with them, help them regain some of that function that they had. And it's really helpful, okay? All right, so then it leads you to skilled nursing care, right? Skilled nursing care. These facilities are usually found within long-term care facilities. And this skilled nursing care is all handled by exactly what it says, skilled nurses, okay? They are under the direction of usually one physician or two physicians, depending on the total number of beds. They basically run everything they have off of a plan of care that's developed by them through a physician. Okay. And then subacute, those are post-acute, and those are just very complex services. Okay, that would be something like an LTAC, or gosh, it could be an inpatient rehab facility depending on the length of stay, or it could be the therapy portion of a skilled nursing facility. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So if you think about these community-based long-term care services, the objectives at minimum have to be economical and least restrictive. That's a requirement, but it's also what you will find, okay? People find that much easier to meet these objectives, especially the least restrictive. Now, what do we mean by least? Think about a nursing home. Is it a restrictive setting? In some situations, how is it restrictive?
The doors might lock at a certain time, or if it's an Alzheimer's place, then they're locked.
Yeah, so the doors might be locked depending on the time of day, or even all the time. In fact, within a unit, within a facility, you might even have what they call a locked unit, where they have a separate lock. So you would go through a double lock system. Some have what they call the Wonder Guard system in place, where the resident wears a watch with a sensor in it. It's basically like the Sensormatic tag you have when you walk through Walmart or Kmart or wherever, and set it off when you go through. And those can be restrictive in some way, right? But that's a very low level restriction. You're not talking about having someone tied down to a bed. Those are true restraints, right? Medicare, in fact, came out and said that, talking about the dangers of restraints. They're very dangerous. If you have restraints in place, you basically have to have a doctor's order almost every hour on the hour to maintain that. And you have to basically have someone sitting there with the patient while they're in the restraint to make sure that something doesn't happen. When I was in Arkansas, operating in Arkansas, we had the state enacted they dictated to us that we had to make changes to our beds, saying that not only, in a regular hospital, you can have 3 bed rails up. The 4th bed rail becomes a restraint. In Arkansas, they said 3 bed rails had to be down at all times. And that really, they didn't even want to see a 1 bed rail up. They would allow you to use that as an assist bar, but they did not want to see a bed rail because it's considered a restraint in that state. It's kind of scary. So we went and removed every bed rail in the entire facility, 120 beds. And I had families really upset. My family member is going to fall out of the bed. I'm like, it's restraint. You just said, basically, you just answered the question. It's to keep them from falling out of the bed and keeping them restrained within the bed. So those restraints were helpful and a hindrance. So there's all these videos online if you want to go watch some gruesome stuff about restraints. They have them where they show pictures of patients who have been tried to, they have diminished mental capacity, and they try to get out of the bed. They try to crawl through the bed rail. They get choked. They die that way. Broken arms, broken backs, all kinds of gruesome photos because of and there's a reason why they wanted them removed. Supplemental informal care. What might be some supplemental informal care? Anybody have any ideas? How would you supplement someone's care? So maybe some of these restorative services. You can maybe if you tell somebody they need to go to the gym. It's not necessarily formal. No one's there. There's no therapist right there with them. They tell them, hey, you could benefit from this, right? Okay. What about respite care? Anybody know anything about respite care? This is probably one of the most amazing things about nursing facilities that very few people take advantage of. Anybody know what that is? So if you're at home and you're handling a family member who has some very difficult diagnoses, you can say, we as a family need a break. And so we're going to ask this nursing home to take our family member for up to 7 days for respite care. And then Medicare will pay for that. They'll pay for respite care and allow you to have a break in an effort to bring them back home again and be taken care of by the family. It's pretty amazing, you know, a lot of benefit. There's a lot of burnout with dealing with sick individuals for a long period of time.
How often can you do that? Like, do people abuse it?
You know, no, I've never seen anybody abuse that. Most of the time, if someone is going to need that and they can't handle it and they decide that most people make a decision just to check the family member in there with the family member. Most of the time, it's an agreeable situation where families are like, yeah, we decided we just can't take care of the person. And then the person agrees, yeah, I just can't be taken care of. Or if they have power of attorney, they just go ahead and move them over. Now, a lot of the reasons that this occurs is when you go long-term care, you have to, and we'll get into the financial part of this, but there's some financial requirements that you have to meet in order to be there. And if you want to receive state assistance, you have to not have certain possessions and certain dollar amount of net worth, things like that. So, yeah, but I've never seen anybody take advantage of it. I've seen them use it, but not take advantage of it.
Most of the time, families who choose to keep their loved ones, they want to do everything possible to not put them into long-term care for whatever reason. So they probably could benefit from respite care and may not even know the benefits of it. So I'm sure when people actually use it, it's been a long time coming that they could have benefited.
And like I said, a lot of people don't even know about it. And so when they're like, I could have done that, I'm like, yeah. You know, I recently dealt with a situation where a family was taking care of a family member long term, and didn't realize this gentleman had never activated his veterans benefits, and they didn't know that there were certain benefits available specific to a veteran. Like, you got to go fill out that 1010 get the guy some extra help. It's going to become this amazing support system for them because they've never used it before. So yeah, I mean, it really pays to dig, but some people just don't even know where to start. Our system's so complex. And that's what it's used for, is to delay or prevent institutionalization. Okay, and that's what the objective of a lot of these long-term care programs are. You think about home health, all of these things here are there to help. Okay, so with funding sources, so Title III of the Older Americans Act in '65, that was really the first federal initiative that allowed some type of service for older adults where it was really comprehensive. Okay, there were other little things, but this was really comprehensive. Created a few different things like the what was it called? The National Network for Aging, I think. Let's see, National Aging Network, and then the Administration on Aging. Okay, and it provided a lot of funds, and it still provides some funds. They've been shifted around. Government likes to shift agencies and where funding comes from, but basically the funding's provided based on population in an area. okay, that comes out from this. So with the home and community-based waivers, that's section 1915. Those waivers are like, let's see, yeah, those basically deal with allowing people to have a waiver so that they can receive funding to receive treatment at home instead of having to be put into an institutional setting. And think about that. You just don't have the resources, but you can receive a waiver so that you can receive federal funding so you can take care of your family member at home. How many people take advantage of something like this? Not enough, probably. All right. Then we're talking about some block grants. These are sometimes called the social services block grants. And these are just capped entitlement programs. And so states get a share of basically federal funding. But there are certain caps on it, so it stops at a certain amount. They can only be given so much. Anyone here heard of Medicaid? Okay, I think we don't need to dig into Medicaid so much. Medicaid, though, probably covers at least 50 to 55% of all long-term care receive some level of funding from Medicaid. If you think about public and private sources, some of the statistics I have say that about 2/3 of elderly persons with disabilities live in a community where over 3 out of 4 public dollars are spent in the nursing care arena alone. That's a lot of money going into nursing care, isn't it? And public sector also has about just over half. It's pretty amazing. It's a lot of money going into one little area, isn't it? So, all right, let's look at some of this stuff. Okay. So if you have anyone here had any dealings with home health care? Yeah, what about it?
My grandmother had dementia and Alzheimer's, so we had a home health care aide come over.
What type of services do they do normally, do you think?
She helped with everything. Like, she would even be like, if you want us to cook, we'll cook and stuff. But mostly she helped shower her and feed her, change her diaper, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a really remarkable. You can have with home health care, you can have therapists, have therapists come in, you can have aides come in. It just depends on the type of services that are needed. So it's really, in fact, home health, when a little known fact is that each skilled nursing facility in the United States pays what they call a bed tax. So you pay a tax based on the total number of beds that you want to operate within your facility. And the money from bed taxes was appropriated to help fund home health care. So I always found that kind of funny that I was paying a tax to help pay for my competition. So yeah, home health care, they do a lot of things. People now go straight to the hospital, they get their care, and then they're discharged home, and home health comes in and provides services for them. So no longer do people require inpatient rehab necessarily, or require skilled nursing help. Adult daycare, it's exactly what it is, right? It's adult daycare. And it's a lot of times because family members taking care of their adult parents or someone that requires care during the day, but they still have a job and they need someone to take care of them. Some of these adult daycares are really detailed and regimented, but some of them are just, bring your adult to us and we'll just take care of them, make sure they get fed during the day.
Was that what one of our previous students who's now in an AIT, Dan, I think that was his first experience, was volunteering as a fraternity brother at an adult daycare, and that's what led him pretty much down this career, and now he's in a AIT.
Yeah, that's right. It's, my first interaction was actually after I became a nursing home administrator, and I was going out in the community trying to see what was in the community, and we developed an affiliation with this adult daycare, and man, they do a great job, really provide a really needed service. So, and the people there are so nice. It always seems like they're the nicest people. That's really one of the things that I miss most about long-term care is the long-term care portion of that, is you really get to know people and you get to know your residents. In fact, you grow really close to a lot of them. In a hospital setting, you see them and then they're gone, So, adult foster care. Now, this is a really interesting concept. We hear of child foster care, but adult foster care, a lot of times that's not focused on as something you hear in the news, right? But it's a life necessity for some people, and I imagine that it probably has a lot of the same criteria in order to become a foster. I don't know if you call them foster parents. I'm a foster parent to an 88-year-old. So it's a really interesting concept, though, to bring someone into your home to take and provide care for them because they can't care for themselves anymore. Senior centers. Anyone had any activity with senior centers that you want to share?
Yeah. So at Memorial Park, it's basically a senior center, and Adrian and I decided, we're going to do these swimming classes. This will be great. It was great, but we were probably, the age gap was 40 or 50 years, but it was a lot of fun. They were excited that we were there, but they actually do a lot at Memorial Park here. They do a lot of stuff for little kids, and then they do stuff for people that are retired and stuff, and so that, that water class was really good, and especially for them because they're in the water, so they don't have to hold everything up, and they can kind of go at their own pace. Now, they were there more for the social aspect, because they were talking through the whole class and made the instructor really mad, and so then she'd make us work harder, and Adrian and I were the ones working harder.
It's hilarious.
Yeah, so, but I can see where they're really good just because they get that social aspect, but they also get an educational aspect, a physical workout, and everything, because they have everything. They have Spanish classes and anything you can think of, so I'm sure that's how most centers like that are. Yeah,
and the thing about these senior centers is there's no requirement that they have specific services. Some are just places where they're basically a dance hall. There are some that they provide other services, and some have really extensive services like that. And it's pretty interesting. I remember when I was growing up, I was probably 16 or 17, my family owned a newspaper, and it was catered to senior citizens. It was actually called the Senior Times. And it was a monthly newspaper, and it was all things that you could imagine that senior citizens would want to have, and we would deliver specifically to the local senior centers. And it was always really interesting when it was my time to go make those deliveries to those senior centers, because here I am, this 17-year-old kid running into this place full of 75 and up women during a dance routine, and it was it's pretty funny. It's the first time I'd ever been catcalled was in a senior center, so it's pretty funny stuff. But they provide a great service. They really do. So Meals on Wheels and organizations like that, right, can help with home delivery of these meals. my wife's grandmother, who has had a pretty rough time the last 2 years, got to where she was no longer able to cook for herself, and so when the family is not able to provide meals for her, Meals on Wheels comes by and delivers a meal, and a little bit of company sometimes, you know. So it's a great service. All right. So there might 5. Let's see, where are we? Got that. You have homemaker services. Those are very similar, except a lot of times it's basically housekeeping, food preparation. They don't usually, with homemaker services, they don't usually assist with ADLs, so that would be something that would be reserved for that personal care category. They don't provide necessarily personal care, but they provide those services that, you know, that we normally would be able to do for ourselves in our own home, the chores basically. Emergency response systems. These are those life alerts, hit a button, notify an emergency service so you can get help in the case of a fall or other event. And then case management is a big part of this. And these case managers are usually established once you start receiving some type of government-based assistance. So if you're using Medicaid or even Medicare for some services for long-term care, this would be where case managers would come into play to kind of manage your whole spectrum of services that you need. They would look at your, you know, they'll do a home assessment, they'll do diagnosis assessment, things like that to make sure you're receiving correct care. 5 main categories in the continuum. You have subacute care facilities, you have independent retirement, residential, assisted living, and skilled. And I think we've talked a little bit about each of these. When a lot of times, number 3 there, the residential or personal care facilities, are usually linked to an assisted living or some other type of independent retirement center. You usually won't see these as standalones. I imagine there are a few, but the ones that I've seen are usually linked to one another or in close proximity. For example, you may have, in fact, I think here in town, the NHC has an assisted living and the skilled nursing facility on the same campus. The new development of the Princeton Transitional Care will have, right off of Princeton Road, will have assisted living facilities, and then I think they'll have 54 skilled beds, but they will not have long-term care beds. So they're skipping, there's a gap in their coverage there unless they are allotted those beds by the state. And as far as I've been aware, they've not been afforded those 54 beds to become duly certified. They strictly have skilled beds only, so they can only keep someone up to 100 days. So you get the 100-day point, and then hopefully the people are healthy enough to go to the assisted living or go home. So, anybody have any questions about any of those 5 categories? No? Be able to write me a 15-page paper on 5 categories? Everybody's all up for that? Okay, I'm not. Okay. Since you're here today, I'll bypass that requirement. How's that? I'm a nice guy. All right. So specialized facilities, intermediate care facilities. So an ICF, that's an MR. Those are for the mentally handicapped. They're unable to take care of themselves. So it's an intermediate care facility. So basically, it's going to bridge that category of where you would require extensive long-term care, but they might need some minimal types of care. Okay, Alzheimer's facilities. We talked a little bit about those. Usually they have some type of lockdown mechanism. Staff is usually specifically trained in Alzheimer's treatment or dementia treatment. And then you'd have a continuing care retirement community where you would have just your normal retirement community, but it would have services offered that will allow you to maintain your way of life and your health and still have reminders of, taking your medications, and some therapy services on site. Some of these facilities are really nice. So let's talk a little bit about nursing home industry, because this is what we all think of for the most part when we hear long-term care, right? Anybody here not think of long-term care as nursing home? Okay, I mean, this is what I think of automatically, and that was before I even got into that part of the industry. It's been shrinking, right? Even though with an expanding elderly population, the total number of beds per thousand has shrunk from 99 to 04 by 48, down to 48 beds, so by 4 beds. Now, we may not consider 4 beds a lot, but when you look at the total industry by the total number of beds, and I'll show you some graphs here in a minute, that's a pretty dramatic decrease. And the reason is behind this is because a lot of the community-based alternatives, they've expanded. Okay, so when you have some of these assisted livings that have some therapies and additional support with nursing staff on site, you don't require so much of a nursing home atmosphere. Most of the nursing home beds are duly certified. I kind of talked about that before, but that's skilled beds and then those ICF type beds together. Okay, so you're going to have long-term beds. That doesn't mean so if you have 54 long-term beds and 54 SNF beds, you don't have 108 beds necessarily. Your bed is a bed, right? So I can count, it's a duly certified bed. Doesn't mean, oh, hey guys, go get the SNF bed out of the closet. We're gonna roll it in here. That's not what that means, okay? The average facility size in the United States is 107.6 beds. When I took over Princeton Transitional Care, that was the smallest facility I had ever been in. And it was a shock because everything that I had operated prior to that was 120 beds. So, and those are big. 120 bed facility is a big facility, especially when you're duly certified. So you're running a lot of therapy in places like that. Occupancy rate for 2012, as of 2012, has been around 83%. That's decreased slightly from what I'm been made aware of. I just can't find a specific website that'll give me an up-to-date since 2012. But I wanted to say that the last conference that we had, someone threw out the statistic of 82% occupancy rate. And you think of a 1% drop as not being dramatic, but when you're looking at an operation that's margins are very, very slim because of the total amount of dollars that you can bill for within nursing home facilities, it's pretty tight, okay? And most of your nursing homes are operated by a multi-facility chain. So you think of the Life Cares, the NHCs, all these different, the Grace Healthcares, all these different conglomerates who own or manage facilities. A lot of these facilities are operated by organizations that don't necessarily own the building. They lease the building from a nursing home organization or a community organization, and then they operate it on their behalf. And they can be fired at any minute. So that's just a little interesting statistic for you. All right, so let's look at bed types and see what we can determine from this. So if you look at the nursing homes by certification type in the United States, if you look at, and these numbers are really hard to read, and I'm sorry for that, but if you look at the total where they're just receiving Medicaid or duly certified, obviously duly certified facilities are the largest portion of these bed types, right? And the advantage with that is that you can have someone there for 100 days, and then if they still aren't recovered, they require more services, just constant care at that point. They can have constant care and can not have an adjustment in their location, which sometimes makes the problem worse, okay? But you can see overall the total number of beds since '03, that's a pretty good drop. And this is straight from the Casper report, which is something that CMS puts together. If you ever get some downtime and you really want some fun reading, go look at the Casper reports that are online. They are thrilling and full of tons of great information. So if you look at occupancy rates, 2012, you can see from '03 to 2012, you had over a 2.5% drop. The trend is going that direction, right? And this is both Medicare and Medicaid beds, so long-term and short-term beds. So if you look at the types of services that are within a nursing home, 90% are elderly. Okay, so I'm going to show you another slide here in a second that may be confusing compared to this statistic. I will do my best to explain it. Sometimes I even have to read it 2 or 3 times to make sure I understand it correctly. But before I get there, I'll go through this one. So if you think about the population of a nursing home, it basically, if you look at 90% of them are elderly, then you have a pretty aging population already, but it consists of everyone. It affects everyone, okay? Everyone will need or could need that type of service. Main things that they require, and the reason that they're there is because people just can't do their ADLs. They have a hard time keeping up with their medications. They have a hard time with getting dressed in the morning. They have a really hard time with bathing and toileting. They can't get around. They can't transfer from their bed to their wheelchair by themselves. So a lot of times that's the main focus. And many people get caught up in, well, how's that so hard? Well, it's hard because you're providing individualized care, okay, and you have limited resources to do it. Some other common services are wound treatments, dementia care, restorative care. Those are literally the most common items that you're going to treat in a nursing home. Other care is, bladder, people that are depressed, and one of the big focuses in the last 5 to 10 years has been antipsychotics, because a lot of our elderly are on antipsychotic drugs. You think you have a lot of body chemistry changing when you're a teenager. Wait till you're an elderly adult. It's a mess sometimes, and then you add in some problems like dementia, and it really becomes a mess for you. It's hard. All right. So if you look at the antipsychotic use in the U.S. in just 1 year's time, how it's affected different states, it's pretty dramatic. If you get an opportunity to review this slide, you can look at the different states that have really struggled with it and continue to struggle. And then there's some who have been able to start to look at this as a major problem and be able to reduce the total number of antipsychotics that their residents are on. Polypharmacy is a big focus as well. People are on multi-drugs. They have a hard time remembering all the drugs they're on. And so physicians have started to really focus in on making sure that the medications that they're on are appropriate. And that's helped reduce a lot of the antipsychotics and even the need for an antipsychotic. We look at financing. the national expenditures are the lowest in the nursing home setting. Medicare pays the lowest amount of dollars to the nursing home setting. Anyone have any ideas on the justification behind this?
It's expensive. Well, I mean, I don't know if that's a justification, but that's why they don't pay for it.
Yeah,
Like, they haven't been able to pass it through for, I don't know, I just did a case study on the 1965 thing where they were trying to have, like, catastrophic care included, but that didn't really get passed. All that got passed was, like, the Part D and stuff like that.
Yeah, so it can, end of life can be expensive, right? It is expensive. Nursing as an industry, if you look at it as an industry, should be cheaper, right? Because you're not involving a large amount of physicians and other higher paid clinicians. The problem that you run into, though, is more and more has been transitioned onto the nursing home side, where initially it was for that palliative care and for the maintenance of the human being until the end of life, okay? Taking care, making sure that they're not diminishing quickly, that they have some major opportunities to do for themselves, and so with doing that, it shouldn't be too expensive. But now you think about nursing homes; they take care of tracheotomies, they take care of lots of respiratory issues. Some are even going down the road of PICC line placement. So all of these procedural things that should normally occur in a hospital setting are being shifted towards the nursing home. And with that, the billing of that becomes complicated because based on location, a lot of times is how they get paid. And a physician doesn't want to necessarily perform certain procedures within a nursing home because he knows or she knows they're not going to get reimbursed at a rate that they want to be reimbursed. Most of your nursing home patients are long-term, and if they're long-term, then most of the funding comes through Medicaid. And Medicaid is not a high payer source, right? Medicaid, the largest payer outside of private funding, and they are the largest payer, and private funding is the other payer for the most part. Long-term care policies for nursing homes are very, very expensive and hard to find, because as an insurance company, the risk involved is pretty high, right? And you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to take care of you for the rest of your life, and I don't know what that's going to throw at me, right? So, let's see. Yeah, so Medicare payments have risen. So they have risen, not necessarily the greatest amount of increase as compared to some other settings. But Medicare continues to kind of drag behind, and you still have these poor individuals who rely on Medicaid to take care of them. I already talked a little bit about the amount they pay, but many patients, when they get into a nursing home, they come in as a private payer, right? And the reason is because if you need assistance and you make a certain amount of money or have certain assets, you do not qualify for Medicaid. You have to do a financial disclosure of your assets and of your holdings. So in order to do that, in order to finally qualify for coverage through the state, you have to spend down to a specific dollar amount and maintain your bank account, for example, underneath that dollar amount. I don't know what it is in Tennessee. Does anybody know what the dollar amount is for Tennessee? I can't remember. Is it $2,000?
It's about 2,000.
I want to say it's around 2,000, maybe even $1,000 in your bank account. So if you have more, you hit $2,001, all of a sudden you lose your coverage. Okay. Now that's pretty sad because $2,000 in today's time doesn't get you a whole lot, does it? You know, when I was 16, my first car, I paid $2,000 for my first car, $2,200 and I want to say $80 for my first car, and it was a pretty darn good car. It was very used, but it was a really good car. All right, and I paid for it myself. Now you can imagine for $2,200, what do you think you're going to get today? Right? See a few laughs. Yeah, it's not you're not gonna be driving in luxury here, right? So imagine what you're gonna be able to do for $2,000 for the rest of your life. Okay, maintaining $2,000. We would have family members we would call because we would have access to their account, and we would say, look, they're breaching that dollar amount, whatever it was, if it was $2,000 or what, and we'd say, what are you gonna do to maintain it? Well, what does Dad need? You probably could use a new pair of shoes, and maybe we can buy him a recliner for his room, things like that. They would come up with creative ways to keep their dollar amount lower. Because think about it, all of a sudden you're at $2,400, you lose your coverage. Can you take care of a family member for $2,400? Can't. It's kind of a ridiculous number. Even if it's 1,000, that's even worse, right? Even if it was 5,000, that's really not even a plausible number, right? So that spin down limit is really something to keep in mind. All right. Let's see. So when we talk about financials in SNF and in nursing homes, let's talk about SNF a little bit. What does Medicare cover in skilled nursing? 100 days, right? So is it 100% of 100 days? Easy question, no, right? It's not. You get 20 days covered 100%, okay? And after the 20 days, you have a copay. All right? So, 20 days, you're fine after that. So as an administrator, how do you handle this situation? Can you always get somebody well in 20 days? All right. So you have to check people's financials, right, before they come in the door and see if they're going to be able to afford to stay past 20 days. So that sometimes tells you whether or not you'll take a patient. So what are your options? So put yourself in the administrator's role, okay? And you have a patient who they don't have great resources. They need the care. You need the admissions because you got to keep your doors open. What can you do? What can you do for that patient? What would you do personally?
Probably admit them for
Okay.
20 days and then send them somewhere else.
Send them somewhere else? Okay. You could. That's an option. I've done that. Done that. Better option. Can I give you a better option? How about you work out a payment plan for once they discharge on that copay? Okay. Pretty good idea. Sometimes you can even forget it. Say, forget about it. I'll put it down as bad debt. Send you one bill. You tell me you can't pay it. I'll document you can't pay it. That's fine. What do I do at that point? I can send that to the federal government at the end of the year, right? Say, look, I have all this bad debt, couldn't collect under Medicare. and they will send me some money to help me recover some of my bad debt. So keep that in the back of your head as you become administrators in different locations. Some of you may be SNF administrators. It's okay to admit someone and give them good care because you have opportunities to help them out. In the meantime, you're still helping your place stay open, which provides more care for other people. Yeah, you have to cut things in other areas sometimes, like renegotiate your contracts with your food suppliers and say, hey, look, we're not making a whole lot of money here. I know you need the job, so why don't you cut your costs? So you got 100 days, right? How long after that 100 days does that renew? Is that 100 days per 365, or does that renew after a certain amount of time? Anybody know the answer to that one?
90 days?
90 days. You have to have a 90-day well period. That means you cannot set foot into an acute care center for 90 days if you want to reset that 100 full days. Okay. Now you do have some lifetime days, is what they call them, and I can't remember the total number of lifetime days that are available to you. That you can say, okay, these are my emergency fund days. Basically, I'm going to dig in and take these lifetime days and use them now. I never liked using those. Never liked using those. Just didn't feel right, and it just that becomes a whole big level of paperwork. It's not fun. Reimbursement within a nursing home. What is the coding system that they use? Everybody's all about how hospitals get reimbursed. What is the coding system? So they use what we call resource utilization groups. So a RUG, you'll see a RUG, and those are dictated by minutes of therapy. Okay. And they have ultra high all the way down to, barely kicking. All right. And those minutes are, you can run 800 minutes and you get reimbursed by those minutes. So you have a minimum data set that it records all of this information. And based on that MDS, you will determine the total number of minutes that you've used therapy, and that's what you'll bill on. Okay, so you get to bill by the minute. It used to be that you could do group therapy and say, okay, I did group therapy for an hour with 6 patients, and so that's 60 minutes times 6, and so you could bill for a full hour for each of those patients. Then Medicare is like, wait a second, there's no way that you're providing individualized care for those 6 patients. So if you want to do group therapy and you have 6 patients and you spend an hour, you'll divide that number of patients, that total number of minutes, by the number of patients. And so we started looking at that and we go, 10 minutes a patient? Really? I'm only going to get billed for 10 minutes? I'll go hire a couple more therapists and I'll just do an hour do one-on-one, which is what the purpose of going to an individualized care was, right? And it's much better for the patient because they're truly getting one-on-one and they're truly getting good care. All right, and let's see, we talked a little bit about that. So, for-profit facilities have the lowest per patient staffing ratio. So in other words, you may have 9 or 10 patients that are being taken care of by one CNA. I'm not talking about nurses here. You may have, in fact, the requirement is that you have one RN on staff for 8 hours a day per facility. Then you got 120 beds, you got one RN in the building. It's not, and she or he is responsible for all of the admission assessments, any other assessment that comes through the building. That person's busy. Yeah, so think about, that's a nonstop shift. Don't know of any nursing facility that runs the bare minimum, okay? I don't know of a single one. But those ratios are pretty wonky. I ran an RN, minimum of 1 RN in the building, 24 hours a day, and on day shift, I had 2 RNs per hall. So that was 8 RNs in the building, but I had 120 beds. So you think about those numbers. The rest of the staffing issues were taken care of by certified nursing assistants. And my staffing was considered extremely high. Okay. I tried to run 7 or 8 residents per CNA, and that would run their legs off, and that was considered extremely high. Most places 12, 13. So it's cost effective though, and it gets the job done. I mean, it does. But when you're looking at, for example, a stay that only is going to produce you around $480 a day to provide 24-hour care for someone, including their medications, that's pretty slim, okay? So that's why you try to run therapy, and those people, poor people are tired because you try to run almost up to 3 hours a day, which is the minimum level for an inpatient rehab, and that's intense therapy. So pretty tough stuff. I think this is my last slide about the ownership. So if you look at the total number of government-owned buildings, it's pretty slim. Look at 915 government-owned buildings in 2012 versus only right at 3,900 not-for-profit organizations owning these nursing homes, but 10,825 for-profit organizations. So if you're looking at staffing ratios being the slimmest, that's 10,825 very slimly ran organizations, but profitable. Okay, and then your government run, the government runs 915. They're not too concerned about the profit, and then 3912 or 15. I don't have my glasses on, but that's those not-for-profit organizations. That's not really a whole lot, is it? And the number seems to be decreasing. So there's a lot of different take-homes on this. You know, long-term care as a whole is going to be needed forever. Okay, I wish we could solve all of these chronic problems where people wouldn't need long-term care. But until that point, it's a necessary part of our society. The United States is, these are really prevalent in the United States compared to other countries. Other countries, they take care of their own and their families. And it seems that the government's a little more involved in helping in those situations. I would, if you get an opportunity to do some comparisons, check out some of the other countries and how they take care of their elderly, because it's really an interesting, you'll find that we are a little colder when it comes to our elderly than other countries are. Any questions for me before you want to take a break?
We'll
Good
take
time
a
for a break.
10-minute break, and then
Yeah.
we'll come back together. We're going to talk about managed care now. This topic should be relatively familiar to all of you because you've interacted with the content in previous chapters and learned a little bit about managed care from the Medicare perspective on your case. But we're going to talk just in a deeper depth. I don't have too many slides, but some of them we're going to talk for a little while on, so be sure to take some notes. Sorry. For some reason, this is the one slide so those were our learning objectives. But really, when you think about the things, some of the big shifts in U.S. healthcare since the beginning, managed care is one of those big ones that has really fundamentally transformed healthcare. And part of the reason it was so successful was because of the failures that we've talked about with fee-for-service, which if uncontrolled can lead to really high costs, as we've talked about previously. We'll talk a little bit about the backlashes that we've had as it relates to managed care, because as we learned even the first week about the different health care and health insurance and universal health plans internationally, what's one of the things people don't like?
With fee for service.
Just in general, what do people not like when dealing with healthcare?
You have to choose the hospital for them.
Yeah, they don't like limited choice.
Yeah.
We want all the choices. And some of the successes early on with managed care were because of their very tight control. And we'll talk about how managed care has lost some of its benefits around cost because of the pushback. Okay, so when we think about managed care, or what managed care is, it's really taking the quads, which we learned about in the beginning of the course, of financing, insurance, delivery, and payment, and it integrates them all into one organizational setting. And it exercises control over utilization. So it's an organized approach to deliver comprehensive services to enrolled members. And the core features of managed care, again, are the quad being integrated and the formal control over utilization. And so how that works, for financing, managed care, contract negotiations happen between managed care and employers to contract and decide how they're going to finance the insurance. So who takes on the risk in a managed care organization? Who takes on the greatest risk?
The managed care organization?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They assume risk, right? Because once they've set that cost with the employers, they don't renegotiate until a set amount of time. So the contract is in place. So they assume risk in that contract. We'll talk about payment risk sharing with providers in a second. Delivery. So healthcare delivery is arranged through either employed physicians or contracts with providers. So again, the delivery, who can deliver care is arranged, and we'll talk about a couple different models specifically as it relates to HMOs. And then payment. So risk sharing in a variety of degrees with providers. And so from the insurance side, the managed care organization assumes the risk, but from the payment side, there can be different balances with the providers, because they again are working with the providers to set the cost of the payments. Capitation, which is the kind of earliest form that we see of managed care, and before it existed before managed care, has the most risk sharing with providers. And discounted fees have the minimum risk sharing. And the kind of third most often used payment plan or payment type is salaries, which does allow some. So that's when the providers are actually employees of the managed care organization. So we'll talk more about all of that. So do you guys remember the Baylor plan from like week 2? So if you can like go in your Rolodex back to week 2, this was one of the first, or really the first example of hospital insurance. And it was where hospital administrators developed plans to help teachers afford hospital care. So it was, they prepaid a little amount a month, the teachers did, so that they could afford hospital care. So when I say capitation existed before managed care, it was really our first example of insurance, or one of them. And so that was based on capitation. And contract practices, these, again, this is like the evolution of and to managed care. We're a defined group of enrollees, which again, you shift some of the risk to the providers. And then we had prepaid group practice, which would give a comprehensive set of services. And those all kind of were the antithesis of managed care, which added utilization control to those other features. So you have a set of services, there's contractual agreements between providers, and often capitation. And so managed care just layered on utilization control with those. And then in 1973, the HMO Act provided the federal funds to help start new HMOs. And so we've kind of thinking about this act in light of other funding opportunities. So CMS has done things like this more recently. They've funded innovation projects so that the federal government often is looking for ways to increase efficiency and lower costs. So we have innovation projects, bundle payments, and then funding for accountable care organizations. So this is something that we continue to see, but this kind of seed money, federal money to help start HMOs really helps spur the growth. But really the reason we saw such a large growth for managed care was because of the flaws in the fee-for-service. So pretty much indemnity insurance, we really do not see, and we'll look at some graphics, very much market share for fee-for-service anymore. There are really 3 major flaws for fee-for-service. Uncontrolled utilization. And so things that have led to uncontrolled utilization, one we talk about a lot is moral hazard, right? So if there is no limit on how many visits you can have to a certain type of specialist, so I gave the example many weeks ago about chiropractic care. $25, I could see the chiropractor and get a wonderful massage. And then it started out, I could do it as many times as I wanted in a year. Then they cut it back to a certain number, and then they've done some utilization controls even more, so that the massage doesn't count. So the insurance company saw the moral hazard of that kind of service and have put utilizations on it. With fee-for-service, we can see overutilization of specialty care. Why do you think that can happen?
Can you say that again?
Why do you think we had, with fee-for-service, overutilization of specialty care?
'Cause
Because
they can
specialty
go.
care costs more, and so people want to go in for the, or
Yeah, you may think, well, you know, my elbow hurts. I definitely need to see a orthopedic specialist, which you may not need. I see this a lot. My grandma, who I love dearly, but one of her hobbies is going to the doctor, and she loves all of her doctors. And some of them are so nice, and they seem to be the more expensive doctors, the specialists, that she just wants to see over and over again. But without some sort of controls on it, gatekeepers and some other ways, pre-authorizations, things like that, you can see overutilization of services you may not need. And then another flaw around uncontrolled utilization is provider-induced demand. Right. So when you think about it, fee for service means every time you provide a service, you get that amount of money for it. And so you may see providers creating demand that may not be necessary. Another flaw of fee-for-service is uncontrolled prices and payment. And so, when there aren't controls, you can see charges set at artificially high levels. What we had was insurers were more passive payers of claims. We don't see that now with managed care. We see a lot more of a major role of managed care in claims and rejected claims, and we'll talk about review in a few minutes. And then there were some inefficiencies that were just absorbed in those rising premiums. So when we had inefficiencies, it was just added to the overall cost for the services, or the premiums, excuse me. And another flaw in a fee-for-service, which we talk about and I think is really important from a public health perspective or from a prevention perspective, is that fee-for-service focuses on illness rather than wellness. So there's very little emphasis on prevention because you don't get paid when people don't show up, and healthy people don't show up as often as unhealthy people. And, so it was lucrative, or it could be lucrative for physicians to hospitalize a patient over, doing some things that were cheaper and they got paid less. So there were all these things within a fee-for-service indemnity insurance plan that really led to employers wanting an option that was cheaper for them because they kept seeing premiums rising. And so as the premiums rise, the employers and the employees are both paying more. But the employers, the more you pay on health insurance, what does that cut into? Salary or
renovations or whatever.
Profit, right? The more, and we've seen businesses make strategic plans of where they are, where they move a plant or where they put a plant based on the health of the communities, because they see healthcare as something that eats away at their profit. So what allowed kind of managed care to come in as was HMOs started to offer these better benefits at lower prices, and so they called it shadow pricing. Now there's always been this general resistance from employees and providers. So employees from that restricted choice, because then with an HMO, your doctor that you've been going to may not be in network. And so you may not be able to see them. It may not be covered at all, or it may be an out-of-network cost. And providers, because again, this moves from that fee-for-service, and so they've lost some control over setting their prices. But those employers, which are, and not just were, are a large payer of insurance, found it to be just economically necessary as premiums were rising at a very unsustainable rate of about 12% annually. That's a lot, because you could not, 12% increase in profit would be awesome for a lot of companies. So if you're not, if your profit is not growing at a greater rate than that, then you're going to see cuts in your profit year after year. So there are both efficiencies and inefficiencies in managed care. One of the efficiencies is that it cuts out the middlemen of insurance and payers, so there's intermediaries. So it also, with the risk sharing for providers, that it helps to minimize provider-induced demand, which will indirectly controls utilization. So as providers become more prudent in their care of people, it lowers the cost. And then that gatekeeping is one way that has reduced the moral hazard or the overutilization of specialty care. And then another efficiency is that we now have more of an emphasis on preventative care. So that helps us detect and treat illnesses in that primary and secondary level. And that again saves cost and efficiencies. Some of the inefficiencies, that's misspelled and I apologize, is that there's, from the provider perspective, there's quite a bit of inefficiency because they're now having to deal with numerous plans. So as we talked about the buying up of hospitals and health systems of provider practices and the desire of younger providers to be salaried employees, part of that is this increase in the administrative role that they have to play because they're having to deal with the numerous plans. And then there is a very lengthy process that can happen when services are denied. So the appeal process, if your service is denied, can be pretty lengthy. Okay, so this shows just the evolution and the role that managed care has played in the overall provision of care. So as you can see, in the 80s, which was mid-80s, this was after the HMO Act, but still pretty early on. Fee-for-service still had the lion's share of the market. By the early 90s, that had shifted to a little over 50% was managed care, to the peak of managed care in 1995. And so since then, we've seen this steady decline. And what is taking up that share? Because we can see it's not fee-for-service because less than 1% is fee-for-service. So what is this? What is HDHP/SO stand for?
High deductible, high premium.
High deductible health plan. It's actually the premium is lower with savings option is what that means. So high deductible health plans are, the first part is pretty clear. So the deductible for those is higher. So what does the deductible mean? What do we,
Like a yearly.
is that what you have to pay out of pocket?
Yeah.
Yeah. So your deductible is higher, but your monthly premium is lower. And what's really nice about these plans is that you can combine them with health savings accounts, which for those in the room, you probably don't. Health savings accounts, yes, no? Some of you know? Okay, so a health savings account allows you to set aside money. You decide how much you want to save to pay for healthcare costs at the beginning of the year, and it's taken from your paycheck pre-tax. So by doing that, it lowers the amount of your salary that is taxed, which is a good thing. So you take out these costs before it gets taxed, so you're getting taxed at a lower rate. And it also allows you to save that money every month. And so if you are, for example, know you're going to have a child in the next year, and you know approximately how much that costs, you can save for that pre-tax, and you'll have that money available to you. What could go wrong with a high deductible plan? Like, who is a high deductible savings plan good for?
Young people.
Young people? Who else? Why would young people be good for young people?
We tend to be healthier and
Yeah.
don't use the services.
Healthier. Yeah, so for people who are in relatively good health, you may never have to use your deductible. Reach the top of your deductible, right? So some years you win. You are spending a lot less. But if you have a major health crisis, then you will have to pay out of pocket a higher amount than you would for a traditional HMO. But these are becoming really popular. They also are popular because individuals have more skin in the game. So some people see this as an opportunity to negotiate with doctors or look at the different doctors and say, well, this one's going to cost me $150 if I go to this other doctor. It's $100. What can we do here? And so you get a little bit more control, or you know a little bit more about the cost of things, which some people like. But yes, those plans are really good for healthy and young people because your fixed cost, your monthly premium is lower than traditional managed care. Okay. And we'll see, I think, this trend continue to go up over time as the cost controls and utilization controls have kind of weakened for managed care. Okay, so we'll talk kind of quickly through some of these because we've talked about them in the past. So choice restriction is one of the main cost control methods we see in managed care. So it indirectly controls utilization. So you can have a closed panel, which means that services can only come from providers affiliated with the plan. So this is the most restriction of choice. So it doesn't matter if you loved your doctor's no longer or is not part of this network.
or the panel. If you want to see them, you have to pay fully out of pocket. Sorry, that's a closed panel. An open one, open panel has access to providers outside, but at a higher cost. So you'll see on your health insurance card your in-network costs and your out-of-network costs. So they tell you up front. You can see one of our doctors for $25. If you want to see someone outside, it's $50 or whatever it is. And of course, of those two, which one has more control over utilization? Open or closed?
Closed.
Yeah. But a closed panel leads to really pissed off enrollees. But we're now seeing, as the cost continues to rise for healthcare, that people are more willing to accept limited choice to save on out-of-pocket costs. But you rarely see closed panels now. We all know what gatekeeping is, so I'll keep that short. Mr. Youngblood talked a little bit about case management from a long-term care perspective, but really most of case management has focused on the care for complex and costly cases. So these include people with AIDS, spinal injuries, transplants, severe injuries. And that's just really to help to control cost so that the most appropriate and most cost-efficient setting and types of care can be arranged. Because there can be a lot of waste if you don't have case management. So people may be duplicating of services. They may be in a care setting that is more expensive than necessary, for example. So it's a way to control costs, but it also is good for the patient. So disease management is really just taking that case management model and looking at specific diseases, and it focuses more on, so these are not really, really sick people, but it focuses on evidence-based treatment guidelines for chronic problems. So it doesn't have to be those really complex, potentially costly, but people with chronic problems. And it focuses on education and self-management training, helps people monitor their disease, and following up with providers. And that is more about preventing or delaying complications. So we see this with people with diabetes or with other chronic illnesses, that the hope is to keep them from having more advanced disease, or if possible, even mitigating the disease. So so far the jury's still out on if it actually saves on cost, but it does help with quality of care and patient satisfaction and quality of life. So pharmaceutical management, we're seeing more of this because one of the largest costs in healthcare is what? Drugs. Yeah. And so there's a large difference in the cost of a generic drug versus a name brand drug, right? So managed care organizations put drugs on their formulary, so that means these are the drugs that they will pay for. So they have a list. And then there are tiered cost sharings for some. So if you get a generic, the cost is at X. If you really want that brand name, you're going to pay more for it. So that's something that we've seen you use more. There's a really they've only done 2 stories so far, but NPR has this series that they're looking monthly at somebody's healthcare bill, and the second time they did it, the first month was related to a bill for lab work, and so this person thought they went and got lab work done after surgery and got an astronomical bill. But the second month was about a prescription that a doctor had written and filled, and it was filled in such a way that it was mailed directly to the patient, and it wasn't until after that that they realized how expensive it was, and it was on a auto fill. Very fascinating to see how it's really important to make sure that the prescriptions, if you are using one of those auto fills, that they're on your formulary, or you'll get a big bill. But that's becoming a really important way to control cost. And then one of the big ones is utilization reviews. And so this is really how, one of the things we've seen a lot of, and there's really 3 types of reviews, but really it's a process of evaluating the appropriateness of healthcare utilization. And so it's a review of a case to determine the most appropriate level of services, ensure cost efficiencies, and plan for follow-up care. And so there's 3 utilization review categories. Prospective is really before it happens, so like the decision to make a referral or not, any kind of pre-authorization or certification that must happen. The pre-authorization is often with surgeries. Dawn, have you talked with your doctors about pre-authorization or anything yet?
My primary, I guess they did
all of that. Yeah, they do all of that.
Had to call me back a few days later, and they're like, "This is where you're going."
Yeah, so they do that. So that was, they'd gotten their ducks in a row ahead of time to make sure that they had the review, the prospective that gave you the pre-authorization. We often see this as if it's going to be a major surgery, like a back surgery, or something like that, there may be a required second opinion that before it would be authorized. So that's the prospective utilization. Concurrent are ones that fit really in what Mr. Youngblood was talking about with long-term care. So those decisions are about length of stay and discharge planning. And so those are happening while the service is happening, so concurrent. And retrospective is review of medical records. We review the appropriateness and patterns and give feedback to physicians and claims reviews. So the retrospective, often we see this with CMS. They'll do these retrospective reviews as well. And then the final cost control is called practice profiling. which looks at individual practice patterns and then they compare them to the norm. This can include patient satisfaction results and compliance with clinical practice guidelines. And so the goal is to improve quality and efficiency by changing behavior of physicians. What do you guys think physicians think about practice profiling? Think they like it?
I think so.
They have mixed feelings about it, but really, this push towards evidence-based practices and comparing practices to the norm. Well, what is my norm? We're so different. There's a lot that goes into that may make physicians feel uncomfortable having someone outside review their practices. Okay. I think this is my last really long slide. So there are 3 main types of managed care organizations. The oldest form are HMOs. There are 4 types of HMOs. So HMOs emphasize preventative services. The primary care provider is the first contact. They utilize capitation and use in-network services and standards of quality. So there's 4 kind of types of HMOs. The first and the least common type is called a staff model. And this is where the physicians are employed by the HMO on salary. And then they have contracts for kind of more uncommon specialties and hospital services. So for the more routine types of services and specialties, they are employees of the HMO. So some of the advantages of the staff model is that there's a lot of control over the physicians because now they're your employees. Lots of control over them. And one of the other advantages is one-stop shopping is what the book talks about. When I was young, this model was more common, and so we had Kaiser Permanente as our provider, and I remember I would go to this one big, medical building, and I'd see my primary care physician, and I had scoliosis as and they would want to monitor that, so I'd be able to go just 2 floors up and see the specialist. And so it was very convenient for my family because if we needed x-rays, they could call them up and I just go up there and get x-rays. So that was an advantage. Some of the disadvantages of the staff model, it's actually quite expensive for the HMO because they are now paying the salaries. So instead of paying for the through contracts, they're actually paying the entire salary and all of the benefits that go with that. And because it's expensive and you're kind of a large entity because now you have all these employees, it's hard to expand into new markets because you really have to hire a bunch of new employees to expand. And another disadvantage from the patient and employee, like the individuals who are in the HMO, is that the choice is limited. So this is the least common, kind of a level moving towards less control is the group model. And this is where the HMO contracts with a single large multi-specialty group practice. And the group practice is paid based on capitation fees. And so they have a separate contract for hospital, but really they contract with a large multi-specialty group. So advantages for this is you don't have to pay those salaries or pay for the physical space, right? The cost of facilities in the staff model. If you are contracting as an HMO with a large and prestigious group, that is a way to market to employers that you're trying to get to use your HMO. One of the major disadvantage of the group model, though, is if you lose that contract with your big multi-specialty organization, you're going to have a hard time being able to meet your service obligations because you won't have physicians. So to kind of counter that issue, the group model kind of, when you have multiple groups that you contract with, becomes the network model. So it's really very similar to the group model, but instead of just contracting with one group, you have multiple groups that you contract with. And so one of the advantages is that now you have a wider choice, so people like that, of different physicians. But as you move from the staffing model to the group model to the network, that HMO loses their utilization control. So they've diluted that kind of control they had. So as people are happier, the users of the HMO, because they have more choice, the cost savings are diluted. And so the most popular plan is called the IPA model, which is the Independent Practice Association. So this is interesting to me because it's the most popular, but it's the least like what you think of an HMO, because now you have a separate entity from the HMO that acts as an intermediary between the HMO and the employers. So now you're getting some lack of efficiencies with those intermediaries again. So they HMO contracts with the Independent Physicians Association or Practice Association, and that association is the risk-bearing entity. So that's one of the positives, and is paid a capitation fee. So they are paid a capitation fee, and then they use that money to contract with providers. So it takes that burden off the HMO. It also transfers financial risk to the intermediary. And they also get to keep that advantage of a wide variety of physicians or providers. Similar to the group model, though, is if you lose that contract with that intermediary, you're going to lose, you're going to have a hard time providing services. And generally, there's a surplus of specialists in these plans. So those are your HMOs. Now, HMOs started out as the first managed care organization type, but their share of the market has really decreased. And so the type of managed care organization that's most popular are the PPOs. And so PPOs contract with preferred providers. They use a discounted fee arrangement where it's generally 25 to 30% discounted off charges. It allows for open panels, which people like more than closed panel, but have higher co-payments. Some of the things that you lose with this model is little or no risk sharing and little control over utilization and quality. And this is the most popular option. There's no gatekeeping, but they do use prior authorizations for like hospital visits and expensive procedures. But they removed, again, one of the least favorite things that people have gatekeeping. And then you have your POS, which is not what you might think it is. It's point of service plans. And they're kind of like a cross between an HMO and a PPO. So it features some features of utilization and capitation are retained from HMOs, but they allow open panels. And they were kind of moving up in popularity, but once HMOs started relaxing their utilization controls, they kind of lost their market share as well. Okay, so some of this is really, a lot of this is just what we've already talked about, but really the fee-for-service has declined. We saw premiums start to go up in the early 2000s, but we've seen them kind of get moderated in the later 2000s. What we have not seen a change in, and we're seeing more of, is the increased cost sharing of employees. So ways that when the cost for healthcare was not really lessening for employers, the way that they were able to cut their portion of the cost was having the employees pay a larger portion of the cost and cost sharing. So we've seen, before the Affordable Care Act, the amount of money that was coming out for families going up and up and up, and we've seen with the Affordable Care Act some of that plateauing, and we've seen a little bit of a increase again, but we'll continue to see those high deductible health plans be an option that many people pick. And so you can see that this is from 2016 from the Kaiser Family Foundation. So PPOs have the largest share of managed care enrollments and this is employer-based healthcare plans. But high deductible health plans with savings options are now our second largest group, and they just continue to grow in popularity over HMO and POS. So this is still, so managed care and the health insurance exchanges, this is a little bit in limbo because we've heard a lot about some of the replacements for the ACA doing away with essential health benefits. And so I think some of these mandates from the ACA in the next couple of years, we may see them drop out. But PPOs continue to dominate the employment-based health insurance enrollments, though a lot of interest from the federal level for the replacement and for not just ACA but other government entitlement is to go towards more of the health savings plan, where there is more cost up front to the individual. Okay, so we're going to talk kind of quickly about Medicaid and Medicare. So many of you guys, when you did your case study, when you picked a state, for the students who are in the state of Tennessee, many of you picked Tennessee. So is TennCare managed care? Do they use managed care for TennCare?
I believe so.
Yeah, they were like one of the first to go fully towards managed care. There's different plans across the state, but across the United States, over 70% of Medicaid enrollees are in a managed care plan. But it's not always feasible in some geographic locations due to just the lack of providers or other kind of barriers to it. So for Medicare, there's two options. There's a fee for service and a managed care. Which part of Medicare is managed care? A, B, C, or D? Okay, what's A?
A is hospital inpatient,
Inpatient. B is?
outpatient.
C is?
Something
Was
and
that-
D is drugs.
D is drugs.
So it has to be
Okay, so if D is drugs,
Mm-hmm.
A and B we know.
It says
C. Medicare Advantage, does that sound
Yeah,
familiar?
Oh, yeah, the
Okay.
optional.
Woo! Sorry. That's okay. It's been long. So Medicare Advantage is that option for Medicare. So you can have traditional Medicare, which you would be enrolled for A and B, or instead have managed care. So what would Medicare Advantage, what are the advantages?
It'll mostly cover what A and B don't.
Yeah, so what is that like? What were some of the services?
I think it does like your copay sometimes. Or
What are some services that aren't vision, dental, those additional kind of services can be wrapped up in Medicare Advantage? So Medicare Advantage plans, so they were more lucrative, but the Affordable Care Act has aimed to reduce the payments for Medicare Advantage, which has led to kind of like a retracting of managed care organizations' participation in C. So it's just not as lucrative for the MCOs. So we can see either a retracting, so less providing it, or the plans being less to counter that, the plan's costing the individuals more, so the enrollees will pay higher premiums. So those are the two ways that we'll see the managed care organization's behavior change. So that can, the cuts in payments result in higher premiums and out-of-pocket costs for enrollees. So some of the advantage is not there for enrollees, so they still have that option of going to traditional. Okay. So what's the impact? How has managed care impacted the cost? Is it?
Yeah, it
Decreasing the utilization. Decreasing the utilization.
Yeah. So at first we saw some really strong successes. But then we had backlash from both the consumers and the providers, which led to really us, like the nation, managed care in general, not seeing the full cost containment potential. So we never really realized that full lowering costs. Tight restrictions on utilization are necessary to lower costs, but rationing of measures are very unpopular, and since many of the managed care organizations are they for profit or not for profit in the US? For profit. Okay, so you don't want someone to go to a different managed care organization because they can get a better, more choice. So you see kind of the lessening of those restrictions. So it's still helped with utilization, and I think the impact is positive. I say yay. What about impacts on access? What do you think managed care how it's impacted access?
Makes it harder to go to a specialist, but
Yeah, so
kind of made it less, but
so if we look at it kind of from the Medicare Advantage perspective and look kind of at that as one of the major areas, we'll look at Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare Advantage plans, they have better access to primary care, and that may have been responsible or have been part of the reason we've seen lowering the risk of preventable hospitalizations. So by focusing on primary care versus fee-for-service, which is focused not on that prevention side, we're seeing better access to primary care, which can lead to lowering of preventable hospitalization. But a major factor in these experiences is the low reimbursement rates for Medicaid. So if you get reimbursed less for a Medicaid patient or client over a non-Medicaid patient, what will you do as a provider? What might you do as a provider?
I didn't get the question.
So if you have two patients, one has private insurance, one has Medicaid. You get reimbursed less for the Medicaid patient than the private. What are some of the things you might do?
charge the other one more.
Charge,
The private insurance one.
well, you're already getting more for them, so they're,
Okay, you want to give the best?
hmm?
You want to offer better services compared to the Medicaid?
Offer
Or
better.
charge Medicaid more to kind of even it out.
So the the government has a lot more control than the providers do in that relationship. So there's not a lot that they can say. There is reimbursement differences based on the community you're in. So if you have a community that has a higher proportion of the people in your community that are on Medicaid, you can get more for each one of them because you don't have those private insurance patients to balance it out. So what you often see is there's a cap on the number of Medicaid clients that a practice will have. So that they need a case mix that works out that they make money or break even. It's hard if your case mix, and that's something that this region, from a policy and advocating for CMS perspective, talks about a lot, that it's hard to make money here because the case mix, just the population is such that we have higher amounts of low-income people who qualify for Medicaid. They can't charge, there's only so much they can charge for them. They can't negotiate the way that they can with other managed care programs. But so you see the case mix. But that encourages or disincentivizes practices taking those Medicaid enrollees. Or they only have so many slots in there, like they can plan out the week, the month in such a way that they need to see so many clients with different types of insurance. So it takes a really long time to get an appointment for Medicaid. So they may have a primary care provider, but if they call, it could take a very long time for them to see that provider because they just don't have openings. So this can lead to kind of lessening of access for that patient population. So that pros and cons, right? There's access for some patient populations and maybe less for others. I have to turn on a light now. Woo. Wait, that's not the one I like. I like this one. No? Yeah. Yeah, that's the one I like. So you can see it. So I can see Dawn. So what about quality? What was the impact on quality?
Increase.
There's some evidence in general, but what about from, but there's also evidence that quality may be lower for for-profit plans compared to nonprofit plans. And we actually see hospital readmissions were a little bit higher for Medicare Advantage plans. So again, like the jury's still out. Really, we haven't been able to see the full, like managed care and its, intended way because of the changes, mostly because of these backlashes. So there are three main backlashes. We talked about it. There were promises of lower out-of-pocket costs. Those were not really, you didn't see that due to a couple different reasons. Again, you're seeing just the overall increase in the cost of healthcare, and employers want to lessen the burden for them, so it's more expensive for employees. And then on the physician side, they weren't really that big into it. Okay, so the last little bit, oh wait, what time do we get out? In 10 minutes? Mm-hmm. Okay. This was a long lecture week because we talked about 2 chapters. So kind of added to the end of this chapter is this section on integration models. But your homework assignment related to this homework that's not due, right? Is this one due on ballot?
No, that's
It's
next.
Next, yeah. Okay, so the next homework that's due will relate to a local merger and acquisition example. But so, as part of there's been a lot of consolidation in healthcare, and this is due to all the things we've talked about thus far this semester. But the consolidation has led to kind of different kinds of integration strategies. So the way we often see this is these integrated delivery systems, where a network of organizations provides or arranges to provide coordinated continuum services to a defined population in an area. And so, what are some of the main reasons for integration of systems that we've learned about this semester?
The money.
Money,
part.
yeah. Money? What about money?
You can spread it over a bigger amount of people.
Yeah.
So you can offer more services because you can spread your money out.
So the type of service strategy you're talking about is called what? It's a diversification, right? So you're looking to try to find new services for an organization. So we see this with hospitals, right? So they started out being brick and mortar buildings. And we saw that money for inpatient care was dwindling. So the hospitals saw where the money was going. And so they started to consolidate with outpatient services. Right? So they started doing more practices and acquiring or diversifying into surgery centers, urgent centers, all kinds of things. So that's diversification. And there's also kind of like horizontal integration. So this would be where it's more of like a geographical expansion and not a diversification. So you're essentially seeing your competition and acquiring them. So they're doing the same thing as you or something very similar. And so that would be a horizontal integration. Vertical integration is diversification. So you're adding services that you didn't have before. There are multiple different kinds of strategies. And so kind of from like the most comprehensive would be mergers and acquisitions, where there's integration of existing assets. And so we saw that happen right here, right? We saw the integration of two separate systems into one. And next week, we have our second breakfast with the experts, and we will have Bo Watkins, and he's going to tell I think it's even titled The Story of Ballad Health. So I think that'll be a really timely one for you all to attend or view for online students to really see the story of how that merger happened. You can have joint ventures, and that's when there's diversification but not competition. So you jointly venture to do things. Alliances, which are an agreement to share existing resources without ownership. A network is multiple alliances, so you have multiple of those. And virtual organizations are just formed through contracts. So there's really just contractual agreements between people. There's 3 basic forms. There's the managed service organizations, there's physician hospital organizations, and then provider sponsored organizations. And I won't talk too much through that. So this is kind of hard to see because of the colors, but this shows you the integration of existing assets on the left-hand side versus the integration strategy of formation of new assets, and it shows you kind of where the different types of integration strategies fall. And I think this does a really good job. And so what are they calling ballad?
They're saying it's a merger.
And they call it a merger, but by the definitions that we have, it's a fusion of 2 organizations to form one, because they really did, they changed their name, but they're also going through the process of taking those 2 organizations with their different facilities and services and integrating those. I have a student who's in her field right now working in the financial office with the CFO, and they're looking at the policies that were of the 2 organizations and trying to figure out where their financial policies overlaid, where they're dissimilar, and then having to decide which policies are they going to take, or are they going to create something new. So there's a lot that happens when you have these huge integrations, and we see that with the COPAs that had to be filed and approved and are through both Tennessee and Virginia, the 2 states that have that are part of the service area. Okay, so the last little bit is about ACOs. I've kind of cut this back over the years because ACOs are a group of providers who take responsibility for delivering services to a defined population. One of the characteristics of ACOs is that there's a share of risk. And so if you can cut costs, provide cost-efficient care, any leftover money is shared between all parties. If you're unable to do that, then the risk is on all providers and all entities. ACOs really popped up a lot when the government was taking on all the risk and they were trying to kind of see how it would work. The ACO homework, is that the one that you guys are doing this week? One of the questions is around profitability, I believe. So looking to see if they've been successful. And I think there's but often not as successful as they would like to be as far as making that money. So that's all I have for the rest of this lecture. So I'll see you next week. The other things I want to make sure you guys are also thinking about, so now that you've turned in parts A and B, you also need to start thinking about who you're going to interview. That's the super fun part of this project, okay? So as part of your large paper is that you will interview someone in an administrative role related to your topic, and you need to identify that person and identify your questions as well. So if you're having trouble thinking of who that is, don't hesitate to reach out to us because we might be able to help you. Okay? All right.